Hey guys, when you search for Bible-related stuff, virtually all the results are from Christian pastors and apologists.
Yeah, to find real biblical criticism, you need to dig down. Most people never even learn about all the scholarship out there, which debunks a lot of the evangelical claims.
Yeah, there's an entire well-funded industry of biased Christian content out there.
Our show tries to offer a counter-argument to them, but we rely on our listeners to keep the show going week after week. If you'd like to support the show, please check out our Patreon at www.patreon.com/Skeptics Bible Project.
Thank you to all those supporting us. We hope you enjoy the show. I'm John.
And I'm Ben.
And this is the Skeptics Bible Project. We read the Bible
so you don't have to.
I don't care too much for preachers. I don't like to go to church. But I'd hate to meet St. Peter when my body leaves this earth.
Hello and welcome to the show. This is Ben from the Skeptics Bible Project. So we're about to drop you back into our continuing episodes on the Joe Rogan experience featuring Wes Huff. But first, John and I are having a conversation about the differences between Catholic theology and Protestant theology. So I'm going to put you right into a conversation that we're having. I hope you enjoy.
We should go back and look at our earliest historical evidence, which is not the church fathers, it's the Gospels or Paul. And Paul doesn't treat Peter like a pope. Mark doesn't treat Peter like a pope. And you only get the proclamation of Peter as the rock of the church in Matthew, which we have good reason to think, like, that's probably not a historical accounting of what was actually said. So if you want to talk about history, and your history means how the Catholic Church interprets the past, that's different than saying you actually want to talk about history, how it actually happened.
If you're a Christian, but you're not really Bible-based, I have a hard time arguing against you. And I actually feel like a better form of Christianity, just kind of making up my own thing. All right, but just admit you're making up your own thing.
I mean, that's sort of what got Luther historically to the Reformation. He was like, well, look, these church councils are all contradictory. The Pope says different things at different times. There's no consistent history that I can look to. So what can I go to? I can go to Scripture. That's the one foundational thing that's unchanging. And so that's where Luther said, if it doesn't align with Scripture, then it's not real Christianity.
Right.
Not because he was like, Scripture is the best. He needed something solid to rely on, as opposed to saying, well, you know, if I'm going to take this Pope's advice and this Pope's advice, and the council says this here and says this here, and things change.
But if that's true, why did he think that any of it was true at all? Because he obviously had problems with the Bible too.
I think Luther paved the way for the German biblical scholars of the 1800s that ended up saying, wait a second, the Scripture is not even solid.
Right.
The Scripture has its own problem. The Scripture is contradicting each other. The Scripture wasn't written simultaneously in one sitting. It has historical gaps in between these books.
People get mad at me, but I say Bart Ehrman is basically doing what Martin Luther did.
Yeah.
Basically trying to get to reality, trying to get to the truth. And again, I say Ehrman just because he's popular, but basically like scholars. That's what the point is. Cutting out all the bullshit, getting back down to like, what can we actually know historically?
Yeah, Protestants and Catholics argue back and forth, and I'm like, just fundamentally, your starting point is different. You're never going to agree. They're both arguing from theological authority, but one of them has 3 legs, and one of them has only 1 leg. And so they're never going to fundamentally agree on what that theological foundation is.
The Catholics basically, they don't view the Bible at the same level of perfection that Protestants do. For them, it's really more about philosophy. When I argue with Catholics, it's always they have these philosophical notions. They rarely go to the Bible. Whereas every time you argue with a Reformed Protestant, it's just like they go to the Bible, they go to the Bible. And both have their problems because going to the Bible, obviously that's what we do on the show, is like point out all the problems. But the philosophy is problematic too, because then, like you were saying, Luther, if you don't have a base, you're just kind of inventing your own thing. You're just going with whatever you like. People are like, I don't believe in hell, eternal conscious torment. Okay, it's just because you don't like it. What's your basis for coming up with that view?
William Lane Craig now believes in theistic evolution, so he thinks Adam was some like previous ancestor of humanoids.
Is this a new thing from him?
I think so, relatively recent. And it's just like, dude, what you're saying, it doesn't even align with the Bible anymore. So what's even the point? And we said this last time, Christians will always say, like, I'm not trying to appeal to the world, or I don't care how the world sees me. But it's all so performative. It's always like, I don't want to look like a total idiot, so I have to craft my theology, and they're crafting it for the world.
Right.
You know what I mean? Even though it's only really convincing to them, they're trying to say, no, look, it's intellectually viable, what I believe.
Yeah, actually, what I noticed, like with people, they're really attracted to any Christians out there that can legitimize it as being not crazy. So when you have a person loves to be like, no, this is a real guy. He's a real scholar. You would like him.
Anthony Flew used to be an atheist.
They love that stuff because it's like, see, we're not just saying batshit crazy stuff. We have really smart people. And it's interesting because deep down, they kind of realize some of the stuff they're saying is insane.
Yeah.
The people that are young earth creationists, they believe in a talking snake in a garden and the flood and the ark. And that stuff is mythological and it's crazy to people that have never really heard it before. So people like Wes Huff, he's dancing around it, being like, well, you can have different views on it. I believe the crazy, insane thing. But there's people that aren't crazy that also believe similar. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally.
I mean, we know a lot now about evolution that we did not. The giant percentage of the universe is dark energy. And
like, to my point, what he's saying there, Wes Huff is not jumping in to say, no, I actually don't believe in evolution at all. He's making sure that
dark matter is actually imaginary.
He's like, oh, I'm not being pressed on this, so I'm just going to keep my mouth shut. And that's what annoys me about Christians. There's always certain things that they're embarrassed about that they won't reveal so that someone like Joe Rogan can move on. Because Joe Rogan might, I don't know if he would, but somebody might be like, what? You don't believe that? Like, that's crazy. Yeah, that was a long tangent, Ben. You can edit out some of our rambling there, I guess. But it was interesting anyway. It was an interesting sidebar.
I mean, listen, they go on so many tangents in this interview that really amount to not much substantially. And so I think we're kind of taking it loosely to pontificate as things come up.
We're using it as a jump off to just like talk about whatever we want to talk about.
It's a vehicle. Like if we were in Mad Max Fury Road, it would be one of those vehicles that they're riding through the desert with like the guys swinging all over it. We'd be one of those guys.
Or you could use an analogy to like anything where there's vehicles in it. It doesn't have to be Mad Max Fury Road. It could be like literally anything that has a vehicle in it you could use. Like in other movies, there's vehicles.
Anyway, let's get back to Joe Rogan and Wes.
do you have a belief, or do you just try to interpret the text and try to see what is the message?
Well, I think, so as a historian, I do think it is a historical question. You have a guy who objectively lived, he objectively died, and then individuals close to his inner circle claim that they see him not dead.
Right.
Again.
This is a highly unusual activity.
Highly unusual.
Right. So,
first of all, there's a lot of stuff in my brain about this, but it's not that amazing that a person lived and died. So right off the bat, he objectively lived, he objectively died. Okay, just like everyone in history that died. And some people would argue that he never lived. We obviously won't. So we'll give him that. He lived and he died. And then some people claim to see him after his death. And Joe Rogan's like, that's highly unusual. I'm like, not really. What about Tupac and Elvis? And this is happening all the time now. Or any loved one. How many people have said, I saw my grandma, my loved one appeared in my house? This is actually so common that it shouldn't even be said. Am I wrong about that?
No, actually, it's all how it's worded and what Joe is saying. But even in the ancient context, which again, I just want to keep pushing back to this point that these are literary documents that we have. They're not...
Right. We don't actually know that anyone did claim that they saw him after they did.
We could just go back to the whole thing that we just went on about the assumption of like eyewitness testimony and that this is a description of how it's actually...
Let's do it again for another hour. Let's go on another like 2-hour tangent.
The thing that's important, we're just dealing with text. So yes, Jesus lived as a person and Jesus died as a person. But Wes is not saying we have to figure out who the historical Jesus is because we have these variant texts that are collected in our Bible and we have other texts that are not collected in our Bible, and all of those are separated. But he doesn't do any of that. He's just making the assumption that what we have is historically reliable.
My point is, even if you There's a name for this criterion that I can't remember, but criterion of generosity or something, where you assume the most positive version of your opponent's argument. You grant as much as you possibly can grant and then argue from there. And I'm saying, based on what he's saying, you could say Joseph Smith was a person who lived. He was a person who died. He was a person who people claimed to witness the angel Moroni. I don't know enough about the mythology of Mormonism or what they believe, but I know there are claims of eyewitnesses to witness the supernatural events surrounding his life. You could say all the same stuff. And that's just of major religions. Like Mormonism is a major religion, just like Christianity. But you could also say it about virtually, I don't want to say anybody, but many, many people who have lost loved ones and then claim to see them after they're dead. So again, I'm not really blown away by this argument, even if you grant everything I'm saying, which I don't.
Yeah, and I think it's also important, again, just to go back to the idea that apotheosis was a common thing in literature from that time period. So the authors would have known stuff like Apollonius of Tyana.
But I think you should define apotheosis, because everybody doesn't know what that means. I, of course, know exactly what that means. So I don't need you to explain it to me. But I think other people aren't familiar with what that means in the way that I'm familiar with it. I think you should explain it to them.
So in the ancient world, divinity was sort of fluid. So there was a bunch of different ways you could be divine. Some sort of a divine being could procreate with a human person, and then you're born half divine and half human. Or sometimes the divine presence would come down and sort of become a human being. So we see both of those type of versions of that in biblical narratives, one in John where the word becomes flesh, and in Luke and Matthew where you have God impregnating Mary and Jesus being born. But there was also another way that you could become a god, was to have your body taken up after your death.
Right.
Or your body miraculously disappear. So famous Roman generals have disappeared from the battlefield. And even stuff like the prediction that Nero was going to come back to life
Right.
after his death in Revelation shows that this idea that you could come back.
It was ubiquitous.
Yeah, that was not the crazy part. Like in that time, that was not the part that was crazy.
Right.
The part that was crazy was you're claiming that God got crucified.
Right.
The most shameful practice ever. So again,
that's an interesting point.
What we want to try to do is think about these texts, like what was embarrassing to the people at that time, not what would be embarrassing to us now. Now it's all been formulated. Again, Jesus knew what he was doing when he went to his crucifixion.
So what you're saying is the idea that Jesus rose again from the dead, and the idea that he was taken up into heaven or became a god, or like in the Gospel of John kind of like disappears and reappears. That's not the thing that would have been so unique and unfamiliar to those people. In that context, those types of things were things those people had heard about and talked about within other stories for a long time. But when we hear it now, apologists now never talk about those other things. They talk about it in context of how this was this unusual thing that only happened with Jesus and no one else.
And it's a real methodological choice because they're always framed as if like we're talking about Judaism alone as like our frame of reference. And no Jew would ever believe X and Y and Z, which just shows, first of all, in Second Temple Judaism, it was like extremely complex. There was like a million different beliefs. Even in like Jewish apocalypticism, there was a bunch of different beliefs and sects and different like schisms. From what we know, it was not monolithic in any way to say like this is what Judaism teaches on any specific subject. And we talked about the Hebrew Bible, and the way that it was formulated was over a long period of time with various perspectives. And we don't have anything written to Jewish believers that really is written to Jewish believers. The Epistle of James is supposedly written to Jewish believers, and the Gospel of Matthew is supposedly written to Jews. But the reality is everything's in Greek. Everything is oriented towards the Greco-Roman world. And even Paul, our earliest witness, he's not writing to Jewish communities. He's writing to the Greek communities.
Right.
The schisms he's dealing with, he's talking to the members of mixed churches, but that are predominantly in the Greek world.
Right.
So it's hard to say this was the thing that they would have a problem with because they couldn't imagine God becoming man within Judaism, or that they couldn't imagine God impregnating a woman in Judaism, or they couldn't imagine God being raised from the dead in Judaism. And it's like, those concepts all come so much later. By that time, like the church is already in the Greco-Roman world. So the texts that we have are reflecting that perspective. They're trying to make the case for Jesus being God in the Greco-Roman perspective.
Right.
And even Mark is so ambiguous in its ending because it ends with an empty tomb. So is that an apotheosis? Is that Jesus's body like being raised up to heaven? And Paul seems to have a theology that is based on Jesus attaining divinity by going through with the crucifixion and then being raised from the dead by God.
Right.
There's all these different perspectives we find that we shouldn't just like push them together and pretend they're saying the same thing.
Right.
Okay. Should we jump back into the Joe Rogan experience?
Let's do it.
When you're dealing with illiterate populations, you're dealing with thousands of years of time, you're dealing with an oral tradition, and then you have us sitting here talking about it, trying to figure this out. It's very difficult for anybody who thinks of themselves as an intelligent person who's secular to even entertain the possibility that someone died and come back to life.
And I get that, but we've already talked about the fact that we don't think that the only thing that exists is matter and motion. We as in you and I, right? Like, we believe that there's something else going on in this world that's a little bit crazy.
There's something else.
And that to, I think, exclude that, I think excludes something that you're kind of putting blinders on. For. And you do have, I mean, you're right in terms of all of these ancient conventions and the ways that things were spread around. But the Gospels are written in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. And they're written in this period of time where you have groups of individuals who could have fact-checked those things. So,
how do you fact-check someone coming back from the dead?
Well,
how many people saw his body, right?
Well, Paul says that 400 people saw him all at once.
400 people saw the crucifixion?
No, saw the resurrected Jesus. Yeah, 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says that Jesus appeared to the disciples, and then he appeared to 400 people all at once. I mean, if we read the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Luke and Acts, so same author wrote these both documents, he says that Jesus was walking around teaching them for 40 days after he was resurrected from the dead. And so these are written within a time period when you have people who would have seen Jesus' ministry, who were there, say, at something like the feeding of the 5,000, who could have been able to verify or debunk some of these things that are being said. And you go from a bunch of scared guys who, because Jesus wasn't the only messianic figure who arose and claimed to be the Messiah.
Right.
There were a number of individuals both prior to and after Jesus, but they die and the movement dies with them.
Do you think it's possible that he didn't die? And do you think it's possible that they thought he was dead? Because that does happen. There was actually a case very recently where a guy was about to be harvested for organs. They thought he was dead. And this guy started moving again and came back to life.
So before he goes too far down that rabbit hole, which we might also want to comment on, or maybe you want to do a preliminary comment on, I didn't know if you had anything to say about the previous claims that Wes was making about the eyewitnesses and the lifetime.
I mean, first of all, so we could obviously go on for hours about that. And we have already, if you're interested, go listen to like our 17-part series on Josh McDowell, where we address all of these types of claims in depth. One thing I just want to say is this shows you that there's really nothing new or unique about Wes Huff. He's saying the same things that Josh McDowell, Lee Strobel, apologists within Christianity have been saying for decades. It's taught in every conservative, boring church lady church. I'm not saying that in a disparaging way. I'm just saying this is not new. This is stuff any conservative Christian church has been saying for decades. And now he's on Joe Rogan and they're acting like, oh, this is this fresh, new voice. It's like, no, what he's saying is nothing new. It's the same arguments. They're not good arguments. Like I said, go back and listen to our episode if you want to hear. Maybe we can address it a little bit and try really hard not to go down like the rabbit hole where we just go super in depth with it as to why the arguments don't really make sense. But I just want it to be said, this is not some kind of new, fresh thing that Wes Huff is bringing here. He's just using the same old apologetic cases that we've been hearing about and reading in books for decades.
Yeah, I mean, that's completely right. Joe Rogan has no conceptual apparatus to really gauge these claims because he doesn't even have the knowledge of the Bible that you would have growing up in church. So Wes is just able to just basically give him dumbed down version of his gospel presentation that he gives to college Christian kids or whatever to like make them be better apologists. And Joe Rogan is not able to push back on any of this or even really follow what Wes is trying to say. Again, I just want to stress because it's always important to go back to the feeding of the 5,000 is something that occurs in the literary text and then gets repeated like as these literary texts are repeated. So it's not like when Paul's talking about the witnesses of the 500, they're not talking about the feeding of the 5,000.
Right.
And Paul's making that claim, and even that is dissected by scholars as to where the creed that Paul is quoting ends and Paul's sort of embellishment begins. Paul makes the claim in 1 Corinthians about 500 people seeing the resurrected Jesus and what sounds like a mass appearance. But it would be a complicated rabbit hole to go down what exactly Paul means by an appearance. There's a lot of ambiguity there. But to assume that there's like witnesses that people are talking to, and again, the thing that he claims about other messianic movements is true about Christianity because these other messianic movements were based on the idea that their Messiah was going to become king.
Right.
And then that person was killed and the movement died. The reason Christianity persisted is because these people believed that they had a vision or encountered Jesus post-death, which we said those type of encounters of people that have died are psychologically very common.
Well, it also persisted because Rome made it the national religion, which, caused people to preserve documents. Whereas like the documents from the Mithras religion probably weren't preserved. But anyway, what I want to get at is this idea that, these things could have been fact checked. Well, first of all we have are the religious documents now. So we don't know if they were fact checked and found to be faulty. In fact, we do have some idea that people were denying it and saying this is a lie. Even in the Bible, it says that the Jews were saying that the body was stolen. That's their explanation. I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm just saying there were people at the time saying, no, you guys are making this shit up. So again, you're still left to like, don't believe the Jews saying that, believe us. And we're here 2,000 years later saying, yeah, I have to decide if I'm going to believe these people or those people.
Yeah, absolutely. All we have are the accounts that the happenstance of history have preserved these accounts for us, not related really to like the validity of anything they're claiming on the ground. It's just because of like, again, just like sort of like contingent historical processes going on that Christianity came to ascendance in Rome. And so therefore, like we're still reading the Bible 2,000 years later. And again, you can make the same claim about Judaism before it. It doesn't make it miraculous because it's like endured throughout time. It just means that like it has enduring power, and also certain material conditions on the ground like have made it be able to persist and sort of like evolve.
But my point is like when somebody makes a claim about something in writing, that is not evidence of the truth of that claim. If Paul says 500 people witnessed Jesus after he rose from the dead, that's not evidence that it's true. That's evidence that he's saying that it's true. If we're just going to take what anybody says as truth, well, then we could believe all kinds of crazy things. We need to like a way to get past the claim and get to the evidence. And that's where they're lacking.
I mean, if you're really trying to understand like what's going on in these texts, you have to understand Paul's situation that he's in too, like where he's like buttressing his own sort of like outsider status by claiming to be transported off into the third heavens and meeting with the Lord, and like having Jesus appear to him like as one outside of time, but in some sort of like a special way that he describes. So Paul has a rhetorical reason to be sort of like talking this way as well.
Right.
And then I just think, again, it's like Paul's not talking about an empty tomb either. That's, again, conflating all these accounts together. Like, there was appearances to these people, the 12, to me, to 500, to the apostles or whatever, whoever those people are. And then later, Mark writes, there's an empty tomb. And then later, Matthew says there was a tomb guarded by soldiers, and the stone rolled away, and angels came down, and an earthquake happened. So it's like these things are not happening simultaneously. They're being described later on.
Yeah, that's the thing. And we've talked about why that's important because Paul, a big debate that has gone on in scholarship through the years is what does Paul mean when he talks about appearances of Jesus? Does Paul think that Jesus died and his physical body was resurrected, or does he believe in some sort of spiritual body? And that seems more likely. What Wes Huff is doing when he conflates the two is he's saying, well, when you read the Gospels and you read these accounts, and then you just factor in what Paul says, we mash that all together, and now we have like a really clear picture of what's going on. But you can't do that because Paul wrote in a time before the Gospels were ever written. When Paul's talking about these appearances, he says that Jesus appeared to them in the same way that he appeared to him. He literally says, in the same way. And how did Jesus appear to Paul? Well, it seems like it was some sort of a bright light and a voice that he heard. It was not at all like a bodily human being that is walking and talking with him in the way that it's described in the Gospels.
Yeah, and even that, it's like you have to cut apart the Acts account of Paul seeing the voice on the way to Damascus.
Yeah, I know. I was just thinking that.
And his actual description where he says,
Right.
Christ appeared in me.
Right.
It could easily be translated that way. So it's not even clear what
Yeah.
the proper translation is, what he's talking about.
It's like,
and guess what? People act like NT write a paper on it or a book about it, and so it's a settled question. Scholars contest this more and more as they're reading, again, other literature from the Greco-Roman world and the way it talks about spirit and body and spirit and flesh, because I think the conception has been more of like a Gnostic separation between spirit and body, whereas those things were materially connected in Paul's day, in the other middle Platonic literature. This is a whole Robin Walsh tangent we could go down, or maybe I've talked a little bit about before, but I think this is all super interesting stuff, but the way that Wes is just giving it to Joe in like what I feel like is not even good Sunday school form.
But again, that's what I'm saying. It is what you'll hear in every children's Sunday school around conservative Christian America. He's not inventing anything new, having any kind of profound insight that a scholar on the subject would bring. He's just saying, yeah, that same gospel narrative that's been taught now for hundreds of years, I'm trying to package that to a broader audience. That's all it is. There's nothing new here. And that's fine. If you believe it's true, that's fine. I'm not saying the fact that it's old is the reason to deny it. I'm just saying, like, let's not pretend like Wes Huff has some kind of unique insight on any of this. In fact, Josh McDowell and Lee Strobel do a better job of packaging it, in my opinion.
If you want faith that's old, you should just become Catholic like J.D. Vance did. That was supposedly his reasoning.
Oh, I didn't know that. Was that like before or after he tried to impregnate the furniture?
Oh, yeah. I think it was part of like his repentance of doing that act.
Gotcha.
Anyway, I could disrespect the vice president all day, but I guess we'll get back into it.
Because his family had been told that he was going to be harvested for organs. They were preparing for that.
Yeah.
This guy comes back.
Yeah, I mean, we know a lot about Roman crucifixion. And we know
brutal.
that, and we know that they did their job well.
Yeah.
And so, in fact, if you look at, say, very skeptical biblical scholars, like non-believing, atheist, agnostic Christian scholars, they will say if we can know anything about Jesus, like they'll cast a doubt on a lot of the things that we read about in the Gospels in terms of the actual historical Jesus of Nazareth. They'll say one thing we can be sure of is that he died by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. Because we have not just multiple attested documents that we refer to as the New Testament, but Roman and Greek and Jewish writers refer to that claim afterwards and talk about the fact that you have this guy, and it's mocked within earliest Christianity. So one of our earliest, in fact, not one of, the earliest depiction of Jesus on the cross is called the Alexamenos Graphido. And it's probably from the end of the 1st century. And it's it depicts an individual with their arms raised in an act of worship, worshiping a man with a donkey's head who's being crucified. Whoa. And right beside it, it says Alexamenos worships his God in Greek. Whoa. And it's mocking, right? Because crucifixion was for the lowest of the low. It was for, like, slaves. In fact, if you were a Roman citizen, you were banned from being crucified.
Who was it that got crucified upside down?
Peter.
Why? Was it because, like, regular crucifixion wasn't good enough for him? Or what was it? He didn't deserve it because Christ had gone through it?
Well, so the story is that they say, we're going to crucify you. And he says, it's, like, too big of an honor to die like my Lord. And they say, well, we can fix that.
Oh, Jesus. Shut your mouth, buddy.
Listen.
I mean, I can keep going. I don't know if there was anything
At least he said the story about Peter. He didn't go into like how that's definitely true. And also, I agree with what he's saying basically that, yeah, like scholars agree that like Jesus died, was crucified. I completely agree with that. I don't follow the swoon theory as they call it, that, oh, he didn't actually die and et cetera, et cetera. No, I think Jesus actually was crucified.
Yeah, I don't think the swoon theory is correct. I think that the disciple Thomas switched.
Sorry, Ben.
That's okay.
I'm about to pass out, so like I'm getting a hot dog on the street. I still haven't eaten anything today.
Yeah.
Is $5 ridiculous for a hot dog?
That's fucking crazy. On the New York streets, that's kind of wild. For like $2 inside Yankee Stadium. But that was like a special stand where the guy processed like human cadavers into hot dogs. And they were tasty as fuck. I think it was called Cannibal Street. So I don't think that the swoon theory really holds any weight. I think probably the likely thing is, or Jesus was able to transport an innocent man onto the cross and then stand next to his disciple and laugh.
I mean,
that's what I believe happened.
I think the part that most people miss is like the idea that Jesus is actually buried in a tomb is the part that you can question. Because that seems actually like he's talking, like Wes Huff is making the case is, oh, well, we need to go to see what the Romans typically did. And if we're using that logic, then you would say there's no way Jesus was actually allowed to be buried in like a nice, proper tomb.
I think that's a funny thing because they're always like, we can be assured that the crucifixion happened because, one, the criterion of embarrassment, no one would make that up. No one would make up a Messiah being crucified because, again, for all the reasons we just talked about, it was totally a shameful practice. But also, they never get to the part where they're like, let's look at what our extant historical sources actually say about crucifixion practices. They would have the birds pick at the bodies until they were nothing left. Dogs would come and eat the feet and eat the pieces of flesh as it would fall off. They would be left up there until there was almost nothing left and then thrown in a mass grave. Instead, they'll point to extraordinary circumstances. They'll say like, well, we do have crucified people's bones in ossuaries. So we know like sometimes people would be able to their bodies buried. And I'm like, yes, but that person wasn't like tried with sedition. And in order to get that body, you would have to have a family member with connection. That's not even what we have in the gospel account. So it just all hangs on a bunch of contingencies. But again, everybody just assumes the gospel accounts are historical as opposed to saying they're a development of belief that starts, even scholars that argue for the historical validity of the early tomb, like realize that you have to make an argument for that. You can't just assume it because it's something that it's a later development. It's like Mark is the first time that we see it. It's only inferred possibly in Paul earlier. It's not something that you can just say like, we know there was an empty tomb, so therefore blah, 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 blah.
Right. Yeah. The empty tomb narratives, Paul doesn't mention the empty tomb, as you said earlier. So that's super important when you're trying to piece this together. Our earliest person talking about this, who goes into kind of detail about the appearances in 1 Corinthians 15, he doesn't mention an empty tomb at all. And so all of that stuff, you know, it's from the Gospels. All the narrative about the visits to the tomb and the women and all that stuff, none of that, you know, is credibly historical. I'm not saying it didn't happen. I'm saying it's not credibly historical. Like a historian can't look at that and say, yeah, like this is probably what actually happened.
Yeah, and I think like what we're saying, I think we said it explicitly before, is just like this stuff is ambiguous enough that it's hard to make like a positive claim. It's hard to say like Paul is definitely talking about physical raised bodies because he specifically says in 1 Corinthians, no, spiritual resurrection. Now, what does he mean exactly by that is open to interpretation. It's confusing. People think Paul is very confusing. It's just hard because the stuff is not clear, and a lot of times what we're taught in church is not reading it in its actual historical context.
Doesn't John Dominic Crossan say that Jesus' body was likely eaten by dogs?
Yeah. Well, again, that's the common practice. If you were crucified, they would just leave your body open to the elements, and then dogs would eat your flesh, and birds would peck out your eyes, and then after however long they wanted to leave you hanging up there, they would just like gather what was left and throw it all in a giant pit. So Crossan argues, like he uses basically like all of the historical evidence to show that that would be the most common way that a body would be treated for a criminal under Roman crucifixion. Like to my mind, like the argument would have to be convincing that that would not be the practice practice that would take place. Like,
Yeah, and I'm just saying, like Wes Huff basically said, like when talking about the swoon theory, he said no, Jesus definitely died on the cross. And why did he say that? He said based on what the Romans typically do. And I'm saying, well, if you're using that argumentation, you would also have to say there was no tomb at all.
yeah, exactly. That's the most important point that I wanted to really address. So I'm glad that you made that explicit.
The Romans were pretty brutal.
Oh, yeah.
But this is why we know, it's interesting. We know a lot about crucifixion, but crucifixion was seen as so disgusting. I believe it was Cicero who said that, the word crucifixion shouldn't even be on a Roman man's lips. The word excruciating,
Right.
ex is off of in Latin, and cruce, off the cross. So that's where we get that word, is because this was designed to humiliate, and it was designed to be as painful as possible. There was actually a really good article done by JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, which was done by a number of, I think it was in the 70s, or the early 80s. It was done by a group of biblical scholars and then medical professionals. And so they looked at the conventions of what we do know about Roman crucifixion, and then they looked at the descriptions in the gospel to try to figure out, okay, if we could diagnose how Jesus died, how would he have died? And so they basically came up with this idea that he probably asphyxiated to death. You kind of drown in your own blood. But the chances of Jesus surviving the crucifixion, I think, are narrow to none. And the chance of him appearing 3 days later completely fine. If the first thing you do, if you survive a crucifixion and then you go and you find your disciples, the first thing you say is not, peace be with you. It's get me to a hospital, right?
Do they have them back then?
No, not
He's
really.
also,
He lost me for a second. He was appealing to probability, saying the chances that he was crucified but actually didn't die are next to none. Okay, I can go. I'm with him there. But then, what are the chances that he comes back to life? If you're using probabilities, you would also have to rule out the resurrection, right?
Yeah, it was a weird argument, and then he does bring up the resurrection because he says basically if the appearance is he's trying to
You can't have it both ways. You can't say
they want to take all the data and treat it as if it's true and then try to explain reality, create a reality that fits the data that they're starting with.
yeah, it's circular.
The data that they're starting with is problematic from the beginning. So
The whole question is, are the stories true? And you can't just assume the stories are true.
yeah, what kind of scientific method is it to say a bunch of scientists got together and looked at Roman crucifixion practices and then also the Gospels and tried to see exactly how Jesus died? The Gospels are not eyewitness accounts to Jesus' death. So to try to use them and then say, well, maybe when it says water and blood came out in John, it's because this complex process was happening in Jesus's stomach due to asphyxiation, and okay, maybe that's true, but for me, no one was there to see water and blood come out. That story, we need to situate that as the second-hand account or third-hand account or literary extension that it actually is, not pretending that it's a description of reality and we have to figure out well, how do we explain that piece of data? No, I don't think the account itself says all the disciples fled. So whose account are we getting where we're getting Jesus's last words and what's happening to Jesus's body and when he's being stabbed in his side? That stuff is all in my mind after the fact, based on we don't know whose testimony that's based on. We don't know who any of this stuff is testimony is based on, even if you believe oral tradition.
Yeah, and I think it should be said. And, apologists will say these are trustworthy eyewitness accounts, but mixed in with these accounts are things that clearly no one was there to witness. It talks about what Jesus' exact prayer was when he was by himself in the garden. It talks about what Pilate's wife's dream was, where clearly no one was there to see the dream. And I doubt that the apostles were interviewing Pilate's wife. And there's many examples of this, where you have a quote unquote omniscient narrator that knows things that an eyewitness wouldn't know. And I think that's evidence to the fact that these are literary creations. Doesn't mean it's all fiction, and that's why the historian digs into it and tries to, figure out what we can glean, historically from it. But to just take it all as fact is really problematic. But I think it's important that the same authors that are writing these accounts that, would conceivably have had an eyewitness are just intermingling stuff where clearly no eyewitness would have been there. So you have to take the whole account as a grain of salt.
Yeah, it seems like we have like a wealth of information on like the thoughts of every character except the naked guy running away in the garden in Mark.
Yeah, that's a whole nother rabbit hole we could go down if you want to.
It's like we don't really know much about that guy for some reason, except that he's probably Mark.
I mean, it is an interesting topic, actually.
Yeah, well, eventually we'll cover the whole Morton Smith
Yeah.
thing, so we'll have to do an episode on that. But let's get back, I guess, to unless you had anything else on.
No, I want to see where this is going. Said somewhat sarcastically.
Entirely certain of their measurement of days?
So this is an interesting question because of the differences between when the Gospel of John says Jesus died compared to the Synoptics, because John appears to be using the Roman convention of counting time, and the other Gospels, when they describe the timing, appear to be using the Jewish ones. And actually, if you correlate between the two, they match up pretty well. So the thing is, with Jews, any part of a day was considered a day. So 3 days and 3 nights becomes almost an idiom for any part of that day is the day. So if Jesus, and because they count evening and morning, evening to morning is the day, it's very possible that it wasn't like how we would think of 3 24-hour days, especially if he dies on Friday and wakes up on Sunday.
So that would actually make it less time than more time.
Yeah.
So it's not like he had recovery time.
Oh, no, he didn't have recovery
That's
time.
what I'm saying. That's what I'm kind of getting. It's not like it was 3 days, it was actually 3 months.
Oh, no.
Yeah, so,
no, not like
so
that.
They're talking past each other here because Wes Huff wants to try to argue the point that, like, well, it wasn't actually 3 days because it was Friday night and he was resurrected Sunday morning. That's not 3 days. And he's saying, well, the Jewish conception is any part of the day counts as a day. All right, whatever. But Joe Rogan couldn't care less about that. And then brings you right back to like his spoon theory thing. With Wes Huff is just like not even like a little bit interested in it. It's just funny.
Yeah, it's so funny.
If you know what you're listening for, it's a comedy of errors.
Yeah, it's actually hilarious because it's like if you had Bart Ehrman on the show, because we're just gonna keep giving Bart Ehrman props on this episode.
Bart who?
Ehrman?
I've never heard of this person. I don't know what you're talking about.
If someone was on the show, they would like understand that Joe Rogan doesn't know the Bible stories,
Right?
even to follow like the basic thing that you're trying to say. So Wes thinks he's dealing with someone that a nimble, critical thinker,
Right.
who's trying to like figure out like, wait a second, I spotted a problem here though. First he says like, could Jesus have come back and like maybe he wasn't actually dead? And Wes is like, well, no, we know the Romans killed him. And then also his disciples, when they saw him later, he definitely was not a guy that needed to go to the hospital. So I'm like, okay, well, I don't know what that really means. But now like Joe is like, but like maybe it wasn't 3 days. Maybe it was like only just like a couple hours later, like, and they made it like seem like 3 days. And Wes is like, it's not 3 days unless you're looking at it like in the Jewish convention, 3 days is one thing, and in the Roman convention, 3 days is another thing. But yeah, you're right. Like none of them are 3 days really. And then Joe was like, so like he's coming back. So he's definitely dead, and it's definitely 3 days. And there's no way like he could have got treatment in those 3 days and then come back, right? He's not understanding.
Right.
So they're just talking past each other.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I summarized it. Maybe that made it more confusing, but
That's fine.
And how many different people have some sort of a recollection or a writing or something that's attributed to them of being witness to his resurrection?
Good question.
We have Peter, Paul, Jude, James, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The thing with Matthew, Mark, and Luke is that Matthew and John are attributed to direct disciples of Jesus. Luke and Mark are not. So they are not eyewitnesses within the Jesus community. In fact, Luke prefaces his gospel by saying that. He's right up front about this. He's like, hey, I'm not an eyewitness. Don't confuse me with an eyewitness. But he actually uses conventional writing. What's the term I'm looking for? He uses writing conventions of the day that would fit within regular biography that was written within the Roman world. So you have a guy named Quintilian who is basically, I mentioned him before with the he's teaching people how to write.
Like, he's going to go off on this, but like that was super deceptive to the point of like basically lying. That's not answering Joe Rogan's question. It was a good question. He said, what writings do we have from actual eyewitnesses? And then he just says, what does he say? Peter, James, Jude, like, I don't remember all the names he said, but that's just a straight up lie. We don't have the writings from any of these people that were quote unquote eyewitnesses. I don't know what he's talking about.
Yeah, these guys avoid the synoptic problem like it's a plague. Amongst apologetics, what you have to force them to do is talk about the synoptic problem. Because once you start treating these documents as documents, you can't possibly believe that Luke and Matthew are obviously literally dependent on Mark. Like, in their descriptions, they follow like word for word.
You're right, and we've been all over that. But let me just, who in the Bible, in the New Testament, or anywhere, claims to be an eyewitness of resurrection appearances? The only one I can think of is Paul, who
Paul is it?
who is after, like long after, who doesn't say that like he saw the bodily Jesus. He just says, like you said, Ben, he appeared in me. And the way it's described in Acts doesn't even describe it as the type of resurrection appearance that Wes Huff is getting at here. He mentions Peter. Well, we have writings in the name of Peter, and virtually all scholarship is in unison saying that's a forgery. Peter didn't actually write that. So yeah, if you want to accept that, that's fine. But why? But now you're bringing on an expert that's just completely lying to the audience by saying that, by not informing the audience that that's not legitimate. You can't accept that. You have, he mentioned Jude. I don't know what he's talking about with Jude. Jude doesn't talk about any resurrection appearances. James doesn't talk about any resurrection appearances. Like, I just don't understand what he's talking. It was pretty much a straight up lie. He made it seem like we have all these eyewitnesses and we have all their testimony. We just don't have that.
Yeah, it's this conflation of all of the biblical accounts into like this one giant mess, because like he's taking the creed that Paul has in First Corinthians. So Paul claims, I saw Jesus like inside me, whatever, and then he says, and all these other people who I'm going to say also saw Jesus.
Right, but that's what you call a hearsay. That's
Yeah, exactly. But scholarship is like, and scholarship, like he doesn't say this is a creed that the church repeated, but scholarship over the years has figured out that they think Paul is quoting a creed there.
right.
That like, a bunch of early Christian communities were communicating. So if that's true, then you can say a bunch of people believed that these people were witnesses. But we don't have their testimony. All we have is Paul's testimony. And we don't even have the creed. All we have is Paul quoting the creed.
Right.
So we have Paul. And then, like you said, even those books attributed to those other authors, they're not testimonies about the resurrection.
Right, exactly.
They're usually like polemics in some way or criticism, like a specific form of the Christian movement.
Yeah, like criticisms of Paul.
Yeah, a lot of them are. A lot of them do seem to be either trying to say, yeah, Paul is really hard to understand, then like marginalizing Paul, or being like overtly confronting what is at least like a Pauline stereotype that you find like in Ephesians and Colossians when it comes to like the book of James.
Right.
It's all just much more complicated than the way Wes is portraying it. But Joe actually did ask a good question, and he's not getting a good answer at all. Like,
Wes Huff blew right by it. I'd have to go back and listen, but I think the way Rogan framed the question is like how many eyewitnesses do we have their writing from? So what you're looking for, like you would look for somebody who is an eyewitness that actually wrote down their experience of what they saw. The only verified one that we can plausibly say on that is Paul. And like we said, Paul does not align with the timeline of the Gospels. Paul says he didn't know the historical Jesus in his lifetime. He either saw some sort of a vision, heard some kind of a voice, or had some kind of experience that he attributed to being a resurrection appearance, which is fine. But I think Wes Huff is basically lying to Joe Rogan here, making it seem like we have all of this, all of these eyewitness accounts of this. No, we have hearsay. We have people saying those people claimed to But that's what we have today when it comes to Elvis or anything else. That's all we have is hearsay. My cousin said that his roommate saw such and such. I'm sorry, but like that is not very credible. Like in a court of law, even eyewitness testimony is not that credible. Hearsay is right out the window. They won't even allow it in court.
I think this is also like a point that apologists bring up, like, oh, well, if you just throw out eyewitness testimony, then we have to believe anything. And I'm like, I'm not saying throw out eyewitness testimony, but I'm saying, like, even if we have eyewitness testimony, that doesn't mean that it's like foolproof. It doesn't mean like any time you have eyewitness testimony, it's infallible, because
Right.
people see things and are wrong all the time. Like eyewitnesses, like ID the wrong person. Like people they see things that are affected by their perspective.
That's what I'm saying. But here we don't even have that.
But the other thing is, the Gospel of John is basically like the literary equivalent of finding like, Forrest Gump and thinking that you found an eyewitness account of like the Kennedy administration and the Lyndon Johnson administration and the shrimp boat industry and the founding of the early tech industry. And it's like, no, it's a book that's inserting a character throughout different points and like making it the exclusive omniscient character who's, oh, I just happened to be standing with Jesus's mom at the crucifixion, like I just happened to be the one that he's reclining against, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's funny, Ben. I actually know a prominent rabbi. I won't like say his name, but you know who I mean. But anyway, he's a very prominent rabbi. Lots of mainstream books that he's written. And I talked to him about this question, and like one of the things that he said that like to him show that you can't rely on the historical nature of the Christian Gospels is the fact that like so many prominent figures make appearances. It's like it's exactly your Forrest Gump analogy. It's like, oh, Pilate was involved and Herod was involved, and he mentioned with Paul like Gamaliel. I'm totally butchering this, so I apologize. Gamaliel or something. But there's a very prominent rabbi that in Jewish circles is like super well known, but he, is mentioned in Acts. So it seems like something that authors would do, like to tie, these very prominent figures, where it's very possible that Jesus was just a lowly figure that was not at all connected to was not meeting directly with Herod and Pilate, and that those are just, embellishments. It makes a lot more sense that way. And actually, that's the reason this rabbi, that's like the most prominent reason he gives for like distrusting the gospel accounts as history, which is not really a criticism you hear much from skeptics, but it is an interesting one.
Well, there used to be a popular theory that I think like William Lane Craig still pushes about like the pre-Markan, like a shorter passion narrative that Mark adapts into his gospel. Like Mark supposedly had a source that was earlier, and I think like most scholars don't really hold to that anymore.
Yeah, they do think I've heard that a lot. That some people think with the synoptic problem that there was, Mark as a source, Q as a source, and then there was a third source, a passion source. But I don't know.
Yeah, and I just think all of that is, again, I go back to that sort of aspiration, like we want something earlier, so because of this gap between like the actual witnesses and like what we have, everybody's searching for like oral tradition or there was an earlier passion account that Mark used. But like these accounts of the passion are so, like, I'm reading a book on Acts right now that's supposed to be, it's Hemmer's book, and it's supposed to be the gold standard of like apologists go to it. This guy was he was the head of Tyndale Publishing, their Christian like publishing wing, and like this is published through I think like Oxford. Like it's like a real book, but he's like making a case for reading Acts within its Greco-Roman context. And like when you're reading Acts, it's like the stuff that he's drawing out and saying like, look, this governor was like the governor at this time, and this person was like the proctor at this time, and like this like voyage like across the sea. But then like the references he's giving are like, it's also found in Josephus, and it's also found in like Tacitus, and it's like, it's not like these facts are like super obscure. It seems like this was the stuff that people were putting in like their narratives, like, well, he's traveling, so this is the route that he's going to take, or like this governor was like there at the time, so I'll insert them into the narrative.
Right.
Like it just happens to be like when Paul's in like here that like this Roman proctor like comes to the village and like, or comes to the town and the city, and like Paul like appeals to him, and it's just like, yeah, it all just seems like very literarily convenient.
Right.
and more like they're trying to craft a good story rather than yeah. Oh, the other thing I wanted to say, so Wes brought up the conventions of history, and we've probably talked about this already on this episode, but I just wanted to reiterate again that the conventions of history in the Greco-Roman world would be considered accurate in the Greco-Roman world, but they wouldn't that wouldn't correlate to what we considered accurate. So they would still be filled with the miraculous and the non-historical speeches that the author would invent, and descriptions of events that the author couldn't necessarily verify but made for a good story, imagining back on the author's life, sort of foretold, again, the accounts we have of the birth of Caesar, or there's a storm and it's an eclipse of the moon, and they're always these events foretelling the greatness of the man, and we see some of that in the biblical stories as well.
The Skeptics Bible Project is a John and Ben production, with intro music by John Lobker. Support us on Patreon at patreon.com/Skeptics Bible Project, and follow us on all social media platforms at Skeptics Project. Got questions or comments? Email us at skepticsbibleproject@gmail.com.